Okay, so I'll just recap a little bit at the beginning, some of the kind of key ideas that we talked about in the last lecture. The last lecture was called Must We Change? And the answer to that was yes, we must change. We're currently on a pathway towards a catastrophe. But the question then becomes, well, okay, if we must change, can we change? Do we actually have the capacity to change? And so this is my attempt to answer that question. And whereas last week's lecture, I kind of took on the role of an Earth system scientist, trying to look at the science behind what we're currently headed towards and our understanding of that. But this week's kind of going to be much more my own personal take, right? It's my own values coming in, shaping what I think we should do and how I think we should see things changing. So, if anybody disagrees with some of the things that I say in this, that's totally fine. It's just my attempt to try and find a way through the kind of where we're headed. But I'd be really interested to kind of see, what you think about this, whether you think this is plausible, and which bits you do and don't agree with. So we looked last week at the kind of the key idea of Earth system science, the idea that the Earth as a whole kind of works together as a single system, and that it's got different components. It's got oceans and the atmosphere and different parts of biodiversity on the land and in the oceans, and also the ice caps, and everything's linked together. Right? That's the kind of the key message I was trying to give you last week. And those systems that are integrated and work together are crucial to us because they support us, they sustain us. And they sustain the conditions to which we have become accustomed, to which civilization has adapted itself to. And as we are stressing those systems and changing them into a new regime, then we're causing very severe disruptions to our social systems, which are built on top of those physical Earth systems. Okay, so I hope that was the message that you all took away last week. And there was another thing that I wanted to kind of stress, which was the idea of planetary awareness, the idea that you and I, we're completely dependent and interrelated to this planet, whether or not we think about it on a daily basis. Nothing that we could do to live would be possible was it not for the fact that the Earth has these systems cleaning the air, providing fresh water, feeding us, right? And so that's kind of the other thing that I kind of really wanted to take away. But over the last 100 years or so, we have seen a complete transformation of the Earth, in particular because of man's impact on the Earth. And that's, had been good and bad, right? So we were talking last week about the developments that humans have done and the social developments and improvements in healthcare and education and things like that have been accomplished. But there's been a consequence of that, and that consequence has been the erosion of some of these systems. And so we were looking about what's been called the Great Acceleration, the huge transformation in the way that the Earth is operating and our role in that. And so we came to the understanding that we're now living in a different era, a different epoch, which we're calling the Anthropocene, right? The age of humans, in the sense that humans are now on a par with other great Earth system forces, right? So we're now shaping the planet as much as many of the other more natural causes that we're familiar with. And as a result of that, we also looked at the idea of planetary boundaries and the idea that there are certain tipping points in this Earth system that we do not want to cross, because that will take us into a whole different mode of the Earth system, which will not be so favorable to us and our flourishing as a civilization. And in particular, we pointed out that we're already crossing some of those thresholds around biodiversity, around the nitrogen cycle, and around climate change. So that's pretty much where we ended up last week. And another way of thinking about those planetary boundaries, which we quite commonly find, is the idea of an ecological footprint, right? So the idea that different societies, and indeed we can even do this at the level of individuals, right? We have a different impact on the Earth depending on our lifestyle, on how we're using resources. And so typically when these calculations are done, they take into account, for example, the amount of fish that we use, the amount of land that we build upon, the amount of crops that we grow to feed ourselves, the amount of land that's used for grazing for animals that we feed on, And likewise, how much carbon are we putting into the atmosphere, and how much of that can be taken in by sinks, so forests and peatlands and things like that. So we use all of these things to sustain us, but as a result of that, we are putting a footprint, we're putting an impact on the world. Now, what's been seen is that in aggregate, the human footprint has now grown and grown and grown to such an extent that it is now exceeding the ability of the planet to sustain that. And that's a concept that that ecologists call ecological overshoot. So the green line here represents what's known as the Earth's biocapacity, how much land area and how productive that land area is to sustain human beings. And what's been seen is that over the last 50 years or so, that's gradually been eroded, that's decaying as we're impacting on the planet's ability to support us. But likewise, our demands, shown in red, which is our ecological footprint, which is the populations times the consumption of that population times the intensity of resource use of that population, of that consumption, then you can see that's been growing over time, okay? And as of about the 1970s, there was a point in which these two things crossed over, where we started consuming more resources than the Earth was able to replenish. And we've continued that period now. So you might ask me, okay, well, how is it that we're still doing that if the Earth is not able to replenish that? So what's happening is that we're eating into the Earth's capital, as it were, right? So in the same way as you have a savings account, and to live off that sustainably, you would only borrow from the interest paid on that savings. But if you start eating into the capital associated with that savings account, over time that would diminish, and you would no longer get as much back in terms of your interest. Does that make sense? So what we're doing basically is we're over borrowing against our capital every year and eating into the Earth's ability to constantly replenish itself. And over time, that's eroding and eroding the capacity of the Earth to continue to sustain us. So in a sense, another way of looking at that is that it takes actually 1.7 Earths to sustain humans living on one planet, right? So that's the kind of the imbalance that we're seeing. But there's a problem with the way I've just told you that story. Can anybody think what the problem might be? Well, ultimately, that's right, there's a point at which it ends, yeah, absolutely. But there's another problem as well. And that's, well, that's actually that it's very misleading, right? Because it's suggesting that we're all using the same amount of the planet, everybody on the whole Earth, and that's completely wrong, right? So if we all lived the lifestyle of the average person in the United States, we would need 5 planets to sustain us. Whereas if you were all living the same lifestyle of someone living in India currently, you'd only need 0.6 planets, okay? So that's for all 7.5 to 8, going on 8 billion of us. So there's a huge inequality here across the globe in terms of who is causing this harm, who is using up the resources of the Earth beyond its ability to replenish. And I think it's really important that we think about that and understand that fact. So for example, last week I talked a lot about climate change, and I'll carry on talking mostly about climate change in the rest of this lecture. And if we look at CO2 emissions and where the vast majority of CO2 emissions are coming from, well then the richest top 10% of the world's population are responsible for 50% of the world's emissions. Whereas the poorest 50% of the world's population are responsible for only 10% of the world's emissions. So we know who's causing this problem. It's the wealthiest and most developed nations, which basically means us in this room, right? And our friends and families. So that poses the question then, so what is it that we would want to see? What do we want to try and achieve? And this is one way of looking at that, right? So this is a metric known as the UN Human Development Index. It's a measure of how healthy and free and how many opportunities people have, right? And how, that the human rights that they have and things. And here we've got that measure of ecological footprint, okay? And you can see that there's a lot of countries here with high Human Development Index who also have a very high ecological footprint, right? And you've got a lot of countries who have a low ecological footprint, but a very low level of human development. So what we really need is for everybody to be in this space here, right? That's the Global Sustainable Development Quadrant, as it's termed in this graph. But basically, those ones up here have got to reduce their footprint whilst still maintaining the standards of human development. And we've got to increase the human development standards of these people, but not exceeding the footprint of the planet in order to do so. Okay? So that's the task that we have before us. Now, I talked about planetary boundaries in the last lecture and the idea that we need to have this safe operating space for humanity, these planetary limits that we mustn't exceed. But the same is true for the social side of things, right? We've got to have a social floor to make sure that people are not left behind and not left in poverty. And so this is known as the kind of the planetary donut. And the idea is that we need to have both a safe and a just space for humanity, and we have to find a way of coexisting together within that space on this planet. Okay? Which then, I think, ultimately brings up the need to share what we have. I think it's just a fact of the system. We've got one planet, we all want to live good lives, but some people are using far more than others, and it just doesn't work, right? So we've got to find a way to recognize that inequality and to address it. Okay, so I wanted to make sure that that was very clear up front. Now, the other thing that we talked about a lot last week was around climate change and the impacts that climate change was having as an example of one of the planetary boundaries that we're exceeding. And the idea that we have to try and limit global warming to below 2 degrees Celsius because of the risk of triggering these Earth system tipping points. And I talked about this choice that we have, right? This choice between carrying on along the fossil fuel emissions intensive pathway towards a 4 degrees or more warming by the end of the century. And remember, 4 degrees was the difference between the last ice age and the present time. So we're talking about going the same amount in the opposite direction. Or transitioning onto this blue pathway, which would keep us to 2 degrees. Okay? Now, the crucially important thing that I need you to bear in mind, okay, is that the world is going to be vastly different going forwards. Okay? For all of you, for me and everybody, okay? Either because we choose not to do anything and end up with a planet that can no longer sustain us and is collapsing around us. Or secondly, because we've chosen to completely transform how we do things and transitioned to the blue pathway. Okay? So there's no stable future. There's no looking back over our shoulders and saying tomorrow is going to be like yesterday. The future's different, vastly different, whatever. And that's you know, a blessing or a curse for us, depending on how we look at it. But we have to play our part in that, and we're going to experience that going on around us throughout our lives. That's just how it is. So we better prepare for that and understand what that means for us. Okay, so we also talked about the fact that to meet that 2 degrees target, we've got a very tight carbon budget, which means we have to bring down our carbon emissions to virtually zero by around 2040 to 2050. Now, basically what we talked about was the fact that it's the cumulative emissions that happen over that time period that matter, so that the longer we delay cutting emissions in the short term, the faster we have to cut emissions in the long term. Because there's only so much CO2 we can afford to burn if we're to meet that 2 degrees target. So we're not talking about long-term future gradual emissions reductions, we're talking about urgent radical reductions that have to start happening now. Okay, so if we were to break that emissions budget up and currently look at where those emissions are coming from in a society like ours in the UK, then we can see that transportation takes up a lot of it, about a quarter, and so does the energy supply, which both includes electricity as well as heating. We've also got emissions from business and industry. We've got emissions from homes and residential sector. We've got emissions from the agricultural sector and the food that we produce and how we grow that food. and also from things like waste management and how we dispose of our rubbish. And then there's a few other things as well. But that's kind of the bulk of where our emissions come from. So what we're going to do in the talk is look at each of those sections and say, well, how could we get significant emissions reductions in those areas? What would that look like? And the crucial thing here to understand is that all of these areas are very complex systems in themselves, right? Social systems. So this is our energy system, right? We have here the energy imports and the energy that we produce in the UK in terms of oil and coal and gas and renewables and things, and they're given by different colours. Don't worry, I'm not asking you to understand all the complications here. But what you can see is that there's about 300 units at that side, whereas there's only 148 units at that side. So it's half less. And where's that other half go? Well, it's lost as waste, right? The inefficiencies in how the system works. So when you burn coal in a power station, most of the energy that you burn from that coal actually gets lost as heat rather than being turned into steam to drive the turbines, right? So that's, for an example of the energy system. We've also, for example, got transportation systems. So this is London. You've got the tube down there. You've got the London bus routes up there. Then you've got the London cycle routes and the London streets and roads, right? All of those things connect together and influence people's decisions about where they travel and how. This is the transition grid for the electricity pylon, so the national grid, and also the gas transmission routes, all the pipelines. And this is a diagram from the agricultural system in the US. And again, what it shows is that here's our crop production, and here's feed that's grown for livestock. And you can see that, again, at the end, we've only got a tiny amount of what we put in at the beginning. And that's huge losses, mainly due to livestock, which we'll come back to later. So we can think about these problems in terms of systems. That's the point that I'm trying to get across. In the same way as we were looking last week at the Earth system, these are all social systems that we use to provide us what we want. In a sense, they are our society, our economy around us, okay? Now, this is a diagram from Kate Raworth's book, Donut Economics, which I really recommend. But in it, what she's saying is we need to think about our economy as a nested sphere of influences, right? So overarching all of this is the Earth system, okay? We live on the Earth, we use the resources of the Earth, and our waste matter and waste heat, etc., go into the Earth, okay? So it's connected, everything's connected. There is no away, as has often been said, right? And within that, we have our social systems that we rely on the Earth for our energy, for our living matter and materials. And then within our societies, we share that and distribute that according within market societies to the market, and also with regards to how the state decides where things are allocated, and also between each other in our households and in our communities. So we have to think about the economy when we're thinking about how do we change these systems, because the way that the systems are structured is because of how we have structured our economy and our economic choices. Okay? So the first thing I'm going to look at out of all of these systems is the system of finance. And we're going to look particularly at the idea of the carbon bubble. So I just told you that we have a carbon budget, a very fixed amount of energy, carbon that we can afford to burn. So that is roughly given by this blue sphere here. That says that to have a good chance of meeting 2 degrees, we have to only burn that much carbon in the blue. Whereas the red bubble shows you how much fossil fuels the oil, coal and gas companies have on their books. So they've already got the rights to dig that up and burn it and sell it to us. And so that's what they're planning to do. But it's 5 times more than is safe to burn if we're to meet that target. All right? And they're still looking for more, right? They're trying to make that bubble bigger and bigger. So if you look at the system financially, then it looks like we're actually at risk of developing a massive asset bubble, which is what's referred to as the carbon bubble. And so Mark Carney, the governor of the Bank of England, has said, if we are to meet our 2 degrees target, then the vast majority of reserves are unburnable. But these companies are valued as though they will be burned. So when you look at what Shell and, well, not Shell, but some of the Suncor and others are doing up in Canada, this is the tar sands, right? They're still being invested in to carry on and expand these productions. Fracking in the UK, companies like INEOS and iGas and things like that. And then even companies like Exxon are looking to see if they can drill in the Arctic now that the sea ice has retreated so much that it's become a possibility, right? So if you listen to what these oil majors are saying, then they're expecting demand for their products to continue to grow well into the 2040s and beyond, right? So BP, ExxonMobil, whose CEO went on to be Trump's first Secretary of State in his White House, right? So that's their worldview. That's their imagination of what tomorrow is going to look like. That's what they're trying to build towards. That's what they're asking to be invested in to do. And it's not just the extraction companies, it's all of the other companies and industries that are built on top of that infrastructure. So we've got, you know, coal power stations, you've got oil pipelines, you've got gas refineries, or airports with planes that have engines that burn fossil fuels, right? So whenever we build a large piece of infrastructure like this, basically what we're doing is we're committing to making emissions not just for now, but for decades into the future, because these pieces of equipment and industries are planned to exist for, you know, 30, 40 years. So if we're building this stuff now, we're basically saying our emissions are going to carry on for that period of time at that high level, which is to say we're going to blow that carbon budget. That's why what I was saying earlier around this idea that basically what matters now is the urgent rapid emissions that we choose to make today, not what we make decades from now. And so we have to think about the commitments that we're making in the infrastructure choices that we're building and what we're financing. So this is a professor from Oxford, Professor Cameron Hepburn, and he wrote a report looking at this question of committed emissions. And what he just said was that investors putting money into new carbon-emitting infrastructure need to ask hard questions about how long those assets will operate for and assess the risk of future shutdowns and write-offs. For policymakers who think of climate change as a long-term future issue, this should be a wake-up call. Whether we succeed or fail in containing warming to 2 degrees Celsius is determined by what we do now, not in future decades. So he's raising these alarm bells for people like Mark Carney in the Bank of England, for people like our government ministers and so on and so forth, saying the decisions that you're making are going to have long-term implications, and you have to take climate change into account in how we're financing these decisions. PricewaterhouseCoopers came to the same conclusion. They say the only way to avoid pessimistic scenarios will be radical transformations in the way the global economy currently functions. Rapid uptake of renewable energy, sharp falls in fossil fuel use, or massive deployment of carbon capture and storage, a technology that can be used to take carbon out of fume stacks of power stations. Removal of industrial emissions and halting deforestation. This suggests the need for much more ambition and urgency on climate policy at both the national and international level. Either way, business as usual is not an option. Okay? That's the point I was making earlier. Things have to be different. Okay, and there's signs that things are starting to get through, right? That things are starting to change. And so you have headlines like this: Lloyd's of London, the big insurance company, to divest from coal over climate change. Insurance giant AXA dumps investments in tar sands pipelines. National Australia Bank stops lending for all new thermal coal projects. The World Bank to end financial support for oil and gas extraction. HSBC to promise an end to its financing of coal power stations, right? And these are all just from the last year or so. And in particular, it's interesting because they're not just about extraction, they're also about the industries around pipelines and around power stations, which are beyond just extraction. So there's signs that things are starting to change, that this message is starting to get through, but it's not happening anywhere near quickly enough. There's other good news as well. So we're starting to see governments say no more fossil fuel extraction. So France has just passed a law banning all gas and oil production post-2040. And New Zealand's done something similar. And in Scotland, you've had MSPs vote to ban fracking from Scotland. So these things are starting to happen as well. We're starting to see governments say, we have to leave the fossil fuels in the ground. We can't dig them up. We've got too many already. Okay, so I'm going to look now at the energy system and look at, again, how could we reduce emissions from that system if we were to make the right investment choices, right? So this is the idea about our carbon budgets. One of the things about this is that in order to get the new supply that we need to, within the tight constraints of these carbon budgets, we have to reduce demand first, right? Because we haven't got time to build all that new supply in the short term. It takes time to build things. So we have to reduce demand whilst we build supply out in the long run. And that's where we're in luck, okay? Because demand, actually, as I was saying, there's huge inefficiencies in our energy system, right? So for 10 units of this light coming from these light bulbs, they're not completely efficient. So actually, most of the light's lost as heat, or at least in the old-fashioned light bulbs. But most of that then came through electricity cables, and there's a lot of energy lost in the cables themselves because of resistance in the cables. And like I said, the power stations themselves burning fossil fuels to make heat to then drive a turbine are not very efficient. So there's a huge inefficiency there. And then you've got to spend energy to get the ground coal out the ground in the first place and then ship it to the power station. So if you take all of those different things higher up in the supply chain into account, then actually if we can reduce demand in the short term, either through new products, more efficient products, or by not using them altogether and just doing without certain things, then we actually get a huge impact on the amount of energy we have to put into the system. And that makes a huge difference to how many emissions are given off, right? So that means that in the short term, at least, these demand opportunities dwarf those from supply. But there's a caveat here, right? And I put it here that we must not lose those savings to growth. What do I mean by that? So suppose that we get a new car, and that car's a more fuel-efficient car, so it saves us money, right? We don't have to spend as much on fuel. Well, one response to that is that we might simply just drive more, right? And if we drive more, then it undoes all the good of getting a more fuel-efficient car from the point of view of the climate. Obviously, it's more useful to us, but from the point of view of the amount of emissions we put out, it's the same. Alternatively, we might use less fuel. Well, that sounds like a good thing, right? Sorry. We would save money, but we'd also lower global oil prices. And that money would either be invested in a bank, which would be spent on other things, some of which would be highly fossil fuel intensive, or we'd spend it on other things ourselves directly, which might have a carbon footprint associated with them. Or the lower global oil price would then make more oil use elsewhere more attractive, and therefore other people will do that. And so the sum total of all of those things is that we get more economic activity, a larger carbon footprint, and that a bigger economy which will then invest in further energy efficiency savings, which means we can then do the whole cycle again, right? So the point there, and I think this is basically what's been happening, why we keep seeing emissions going up and up over time, because although we're trying to be more and more efficient, we're actually using that extra benefit that we get to find other ways to use that energy. So rather than having the thermostat down, we'll just turn it that bit more if we have a more insulated house because we can afford it, right? So the point that I'm trying to get at here is that we have to have some other methods to cap our spending in things that we don't want, which is things associated with fossil fuels. And so one example of that might be having a carbon price on things in order to try and prevent these kind of rebound effects from happening. But this is a graph that shows you that it is happening, as I said, right? So this is from the University of Leeds. They look at different sectors, so agriculture, clothes, transport, manufacturing, mining, etc. And this is saying, as we reduce the emissions intensity of these things, as we make them more efficient, we end up just using more of them, right? So the other thing to kind of bear in mind here is that it doesn't make sense to try and just focus on reducing demand, that is the consumption of these things, if we continue to increase the extraction. So if we're continuing to invest in fossil fuel infrastructure, in more coal mines, in more oil wells, etc., then that has to go somewhere. It goes into the market. And if we're trying to reduce demand on the other side, it's like trying to stop a train with the brakes on the front whilst carrying on driving it from behind, right? It just doesn't work. So we can't minimize the consumption of fossil fuels whilst also pledging to maximize the fossil fuel supply. And you hear some really contradictory government statements around things like this, right? So we've got to reduce emissions as fast as we can, and we've got to get every last drop of North Sea oil out of the ground as quickly as we can, right? It doesn't make sense. We have to look at this more systemically than that. Okay, so this pie chart shows you the world energy infrastructure from a few years ago. These next few slides all come from a man called Saul Griffith, a US entrepreneur, and he did this amazing analysis a few years ago where he looked both at his own personal lifestyle but also kind of the big energy system. So I've just picked out a few of those kind of graphs. So this shows you our current energy system. Coal is a very large majority of emissions, so is oil, and we get a lot of energy still from burning plants in stoves, particularly in developing countries. They get a lot of their heating from burning wood and biomass. But you see that solar and wind and hydro are just a tiny, tiny fraction currently of the world's energy supply. This is a more up-to-date analysis just published by BP recently, but it's really good data on these things. So we've got growth in coal, although it's just been going down a little bit recently. Massive growth in oil and gas, but renewables have been taking off exponentially, right? So that's a really good news. Like, they're growing at a very dramatic rate, but because it's proportional to how big they are already, then the growth in fossil fuels, although it's declining relative to, well, it's lower than the renewables, it still means proportionally they're getting bigger and bigger all the time. And if we look at the global energy supply, then fossil fuels have basically been supplying about 80% of global energy for the last 20, 30 years, right? So there's no change in that. So that's something to be aware of. So basically what we're saying is that this will have to be a really major transformation, okay? I think that's the kind of key point. So imagine that in 20 years or so from now, we were to have completely, to have reduced our emissions in line with what we need to do. So I'm going to be agnostic about which technologies we use. So, for example, we could use nuclear. So this is saying we build 3 terawatts of energy from nuclear. We build 2 from geothermal, 2 from wind, 2 from solar thermal, and 2 from solar photovoltaic, and then we've still got some fossil fuels left, but which would continue to need to be wound down, okay? So this is a really major change. What would that look like in terms of building it? What do we have to do to build that? And I'll come back to that point. Okay, so we've got, so this is basically saying that to build that 2 terawatts of solar thermal, we'd have to build 50 meters squared of solar thermal mirrors every second for the next 25 years and site them in very good places. To build the 2 terawatts of solar photovoltaic, we'd have to build 100 meters squared of that every second for the next 25 years. 2 terawatts of new wind would mean 12 3-megawatt turbines in great locations every hour, or 100 centimeter diameter turbine every 5 minutes. 100 meters, sorry, that was. 3 terawatts of nuclear energy would be 1 3 gigawatt nuclear energy plant every week for the next 25 years. 2 terawatts of geothermal would be 300 megawatt steam turbines every day for the next 25 years. Okay, so that's to kind of give you a feel for what this is about. And this isn't just for the UK, this is for the globe, right? So we wouldn't be doing it all here, but that's the kind of transformation that we'd have to do. And we'd also have to build biofuels as well in order to power things like planes and things that you can't decarbonize any other way, right? So just to give you another feel of what that's like, so currently Coke and Pepsi, they make about 110 billion cans or so a year, right? So to make the solar mirrors for the 200 gigawatts of solar thermal, then basically you'd be using the whole productive capacity of Pepsi and Coke to make mirrors instead of Coke cans, okay? Something like that. Or, again, cell phones, right? To make the solar photovoltaics, you'd need to have the same kind of capacity as Nokia, Intel, and AMD had for making solar panels instead of mobile phones. And again, you know, you can see the date of this because Nokia's not in, in business anymore. And then also you've got for the wind turbines, right? So GM, General Motors, produce about 1 car every 2 minutes. Okay, so if we took all the productive capacity of GM and Ford, they would make about 1 wind turbine every 5 minutes, more or less. Okay, that's the kind of transformation that we need to see from our industrial sectors. It's comparable only really to what happened in World War II, when for a 5-year period, in order to beat the Nazis, you know, basically the entire industrial productive capacity of the United States and Great Britain and the Empire was devoted to building weapons of war, right? They built 300,000 warplanes in that time, in those few years that the US were in the war. So this can happen, and they did that basically by taking over the entire car industry at the time. But that's the kind of transformation that we have to see going forwards for the next 25 years. And you don't hear politicians really saying that. So we really need to start hearing that from our leaders. Okay. One thing that's really on our side here is the amazing reductions in the cost of producing these things. And I think you couldn't have even predicted this just a few years ago. And so this is a decline in the cost of producing solar power. This is on a log-log plot, so this is a massively exponentially decreasing curve. And basically, since 1976, the cost of producing solar power has reduced by 99%, and it's reduced by 80% just since 2008. And this was done a few years ago as well, so 2015, right? So it just keeps going down through the floor. Lithium-ion batteries used for powering electric cars and things like that, they've fallen in prices by 40% just since 2010 and are continuing to go down and down and down. Likewise, wind is following this same kind of trajectories. Wind has fallen in price by 1/3 since 2008, and again, this was a few years ago, 2013. It's reduced even more since then. And so we shouldn't be surprised that in the same way I was saying Earth system scientists are constantly surprised by the rate of changes that we're seeing in the Earth system, we're actually constantly being surprised by the rate of adoption of these new renewable energy technologies within our energy system. So these are predictions from the World Energy Outlook produced by the EIA every year, and it goes back a few years to 2006, and they were this is what they're predicting from wind and solar back then, and you can see they were completely off, right? We've seen far greater deployments every single year than they were predicting. And that's partly because of just the fact that we base our assumptions on what we're familiar with, on what we saw behind us, but it doesn't really apply going forward in these new technologies. Another really major transformation that, again, a few years ago you probably wouldn't have been able to see on the cards, was the huge decline in the use of coal in the UK power stations. Back in only 2008, Gordon Brown and Tony Blair's governments were talking about building new coal power stations in the UK, and Greenpeace and the like got up there at Kingsnorth and painted on these things and took the government to court on it, and they won in the court of public opinion. The government's dropped those plans, and since then they've actually dramatically reduced the amount of coal being used to power the UK energy system. Now to the lowest level it's ever been, right? Lower than it was even in late Victorian times. So the UK has now promised to close all coal power stations by 2025. So that's a huge transformation just from the last decade as to where we're now going. And to one up them, the French went and said that they'll close all theirs by 2021. All right? Partly because they don't have very many. So the other thing that we can see is that because of the way that renewable energies are much more decentralized, you can build them in small components. You don't have to build these massive mega plants. They're amenable to things like community energy projects. So you're starting to see municipalities and groups all across the world getting together, using their own small savings to build things like these wind farms and power stations, which means that we can scale these things up far more quickly than we can build really large power stations, which take a long time to kind of finance and secure contracts for the entire operation of those things. So this is a really promising and gives us a hope that things can transform much more quickly. And also, from our point of view, I think as young people looking at the future, there's huge job opportunities here, right? So what it means is that we're going to find, if we tackle this, that there's loads of things for us to get stuck into, building, constructing. I was just describing just the scale of this. And so there's some really exciting major projects and areas for development and innovation that will be open to us to go for. So that was the energy system. I'm going to quickly now go through some of the others. So transport and planning, I've put those two together. So this is from the Centre for Technology. They've got a really interesting report called Zero Carbon Britain. I would recommend everybody look at that. But this is what they're saying currently travel looks like in the UK. Basic emissions coming from cars, buses, rail, road freight, shipping and aviation. This is what we could do just by reducing demand for travel, avoiding journeys that we don't really need to take, and also moving things closer together so that we don't have to travel so far apart. And then if we can improve the efficiency and change technologies a bit, then we can probably get it down to that, which starts looking much more like the kind of transformation that we need to see. Basically, what would that look like from a demand reduction point of view? So here's looking at cars, trains, buses, bikes, motorbikes, cycles and people in terms of how many miles a year people would travel normally on average on these different modes of transport. So that's in 2010, and that's what it would have to look like under this scenario that they were just outlining in terms of how much demand had been reduced. And you can see that we're going to be cycling a lot more, using the bus a lot more, using trains more and driving a lot less. That's the kind of vision that they have for how we could have a new transportation system. You'll notice that there's one mode of transport on there that isn't addressed. So if anybody spots that, you can ask me about it at the end of the lecture. So going forward, we've got electric cars coming on leaps and bounds at the moment. So these are the kind of range of electric cars that will be expected to be on the market in just the next few years, far more than currently are available. And you can see again the range of travel that those cars can do and also the cost and different brackets. So what you can see is that beyond about 150 to 200 miles, those cars start becoming very good for just getting around anywhere. They're completely useful for long distance travel. Below that, they're going to still be useful for living in a city doing the short journeys that we do most every day. And so what we can see is that these cars are going to be available and they're going to be useful in a way that they haven't been in the past. And we're starting to see governments saying, okay, well, that means that we can basically bet on them. So in the UK, we've now said that they're going to ban the sale of all diesel and petrol cars and vans by 2040. Scotland said we can do better than that, so they said we can do it by 2032. India has said that they can do even better than that, and they're trying to have all cars electric by 2030 now. That's their promise. And the Norwegians, I think, rightly said, well, as a developed country, we should do better than the developing world. And so they've now announced that they're going to aim to be all electric by 2025. And again, that starts to look like the kind of transformation that we really need to see. And it's not just cars, private transport, it's also public transport. So this is Shenzhen's new electric bus fleet. They've got 16,000 buses, all electrically charged, and that's apparently more buses than all of the cities in the US put together. So that's a completely different, again, approach to transportation, and it's partly because of the cost, it's actually less, partly because of the air quality and how much it improves the living conditions in the cities, and then also because of climate change, obviously. So there's real incentives to do this, and if you look at what the experts are saying, they're now saying that electric bus fleets will probably make up half the world's bus fleet by 2025. So again, a massive transformation, and it might even be better than that if things carry on the trends that they're on. If we look at not just then private transport or public transport, but also in particular this kind of active travel, and remember I showed you that in that kind of prediction of how we can reduce demand, then having the infrastructure in place to facilitate that active travel is really crucial. Having proper bike lanes, having changing facilities around the place, making sure that bikes you can lock them up in safe places and things like that. This is from Copenhagen. This is one of the bike superhighways that they've designed in the city in order to help people get around above the roads and safely, not being in the way of any traffic. And they're hugely popular. People really want to do this, and partly because it's quicker, but also partly because it's healthier, right? and it's also more convenient. So we're starting to see many cities adopting these kind of approaches now. This is Paris, and you might be aware that recently Paris has actually pedestrianised its entire left bank along the Seine, so that it now looks like this. And again, it's hugely popular with people living in Paris. They really enjoy having this extra space to walk by the river, to socialise, and it's made it a much more livable place for them. It's now been so popular that they're hiring landscapers to design a new park to kind of go into this place of that old road, and they're looking at whether or not that would be an option. So we're starting to see that transformation where roads are being reclaimed and transformed into public places, spaces which can be useful in many other ways apart from being driven on. And if we do transition from having our cities where people are mostly driving around in cars, and instead either on bikes or in buses or walking, we save a huge amount of space. Right? This is what this is showing. The amount of space to transport the same number of people by car is vast because of all the extra space that those cars take up. And so that's true when they're being driven, but it's even more true when they're being parked. And cars are parked for about 90% of the time. So they're not being used, they're just sitting there filling up space that could be used for many other different things. And therefore, when we look at cities like, say, Atlanta, which is built on this kind of very sprawling model where you have to have a car to get from the suburbs to downtown and around and do your day-to-day chores, versus, say, somewhere like Barcelona. And the two cities have almost the same population, about 5 million people in each one, in the same area. But because Barcelona is so much more dense and urban, and people are able to get around just by walking places to get what they want, it means that the carbon footprint of living in one to the other is a difference of a factor of about 10, right? And people much prefer, I think, living in Barcelona as well. So what this shows is the huge difference between the amount of emissions of transport in cities that are very low density as opposed to high density. And it's this huge exponential decrease, right? So if you're living in a hyperdensity like Hong Kong, your transport emissions are really low compared to if you're living in a really low density city like Houston or Phoenix and many of these other American cities that are based on this model of the suburban areas outside the city and then the downtown parts of the city. And basically what's being said now is that town planning, architecture, and so on and so forth has to be to try and create new hubs within those suburbs which prevent the need for people to travel so much, and also to make the cities far more dense, to allow people to use them as they want to. So that's going to require us building a lot of new homes, and we know that there's a housing crisis anyway, that we're needing to build homes. So we need to make sure that those homes are low carbon, right? That they're passive house standard. We can do this. We've got the technology and it's being used in other countries already. But unfortunately, again, the government walked back on its promise to deliver this in 2016 in the UK, to mandate the fact that all new homes would have to be zero carbon. It's something, again, that we could push for to see if we can get that. But basically, we have the technology to build homes that don't need any extra heating or extra lighting beyond what it can supply for itself. And so you can imagine building whole new districts, whole new eco-districts in our cities, around our cities, that allow people to live in these new energy-efficient houses, homes close to where they work, so that they can just travel using active travel or public transit rather than having their own cars. But it requires us to look at how we're making planning decisions, how we're zoning our cities and the areas around them. And it also means for the houses that we're currently living in and will continue to live in going forwards, that we have to make them, again, more energy fit for the future. And so there's been several reports looking at this and what this would mean for the UK housing stock. And for example, we would have to insulate 25 million homes going forwards over this period of time, between now and 2050, and that's roughly one every minute. Okay, so that's again a huge task, a huge opportunity to make our homes better. Again, we've got huge problems with fuel poverty in the UK. Again, if we could provide warm homes for everybody, we'd also be making them, lower carbon, which is a win-win. Okay, so the last one I'm going to look at now is around food and land use, and I'll try and hurry this up because I'm taking a bit too long. So one, I pointed out the huge waste inefficiencies within the current food system. This is a report by the Institution of Mechanical Engineering, and they said that due to poor practices in harvesting, storage and transportation, as well as market and consumer wastage, it is estimated that between 30 and 50% of all food produced never reaches a human stomach. Now, the reasons for this differ depending on where you are in the world. So if you're in a developed country like ours, it's almost all to do with on the consumer end, right? So it's either waste at home because of buying too much and not using it up properly, or it's waste at supermarkets where they've got it on their shelves but haven't sold it, so just tip it, or it's because of the standards that the supermarkets put on what they buy from farmers and saying your produce don't meet those standards, therefore you just have to leave them in the fields. And so it's those kind of things that are predominantly responsible for this food waste in the West than developed countries. If you look on the other side of the world, then it's actually much more to do with not being able to get your produce to market. So either storage is not good enough or transportation isn't good enough, and therefore before it can be sold and used, it's spoiled. And things like refrigeration become a really important thing there as well. So there's different reasons for this, and they can all be tackled in different ways. But the other thing, obviously, is that particular types of food have different carbon footprints associated with them. So vegetables and soya and things like that have a very low carbon footprint compared to things like meat, pork and beef and lamb, right? And that's because of the ways that animals, you have to feed them a lot of food that could be eaten by us in order to make them grow. And so there's an inefficiency there because you've got to feed food that could be eaten to other animals which only use a part of that to grow and lose most of that as heat and waste. So because of those inefficiencies, what we find is that the foods that are most environmentally impactful are things like meat and cheese and fish and dairy. Whereas fruit and vegetable and grains are much better for the environment. But it just so happens that those are the things that are better for us as well. And it's very convenient that we know what we shouldn't be eating, what's unhealthy for us. It happens to be red meat, lots of fatty foods, dairy, cheese, things like that. So if we were to eat a healthy diet for a human being, and again, we've got huge problems with poor eating and malnutrition, both in the West and obviously in developing countries, then addressing that would also have a very good environmental benefit. And we're seeing really interesting transitions happening around this just now. So for example, we're hearing about the number of vegans in the UK really dramatically increasing. A recent study found that there is now 3.5 million vegans in the UK, which is about 7% of the population. China has announced plans to try and cut meat consumption by 50% as a means of trying to reduce the environmental impact that livestock's having, but also in order to address issues of poor diet amongst its citizens. And then another thing I think you're going to be hearing about lots more in the coming years is around new technologies. So this is lab-grown meat, right? So the idea that in order to reduce the environmental and some of the ethical concerns around the way that we rear animals, we talked a bit about that in the last lecture, then we can find new alternative technologies that could allow us to do that without having those same consequences. So that's something that we would probably be hearing a lot more about, I think. So, but the consequence of all of these things, these shifts in diets, these shifts in how we produce and use our food, means that we're going to have a very different land use system in the UK and other countries if we go down that model. So this is again from Zero Carbon Britain, and the different colours represent different land uses. So the pink here represents grassland for livestock, and the yellow here is food for livestock. And you can see currently in the UK, the vast majority of land is used either for one of those two things. So it's not going to directly feeding us, it's feeding animals which then feed us. The other thing is, in their scenario, they have a lot more fuel coming from forests and biomass. So they say, well, instead of using it to grow meat, we could use that to grow fuel for powering our energy system. But we still have a lot more area left, which we could use to reforest, and that would act as a carbon sink and draw carbon out from our system. And then we'd actually even have a bit left over, which we could use for various types of nature conservation, and that's more than we currently have in the UK. So they're looking for a scenario which is holistic in its outlook, right? How do we integrate our land use for food, for energy production, and for carbon storage? And again, that's the kind of level at which this has to happen, but that means rethinking our subsidies for farming and agricultural practice. It means retraining our farmers to use different methods and to reskill them and re-equip them with different technologies. And one different technology would be the transition from the kind of monocultural kind of farming that we currently use today, particularly with regards to things like arable agriculture, to a much more polycultural agroecological form of farming, which takes into account the natural processes of ecosystems to put them to full effect, to actually take off the burden of trying to manage these systems instead of and fighting them, but rather working with them. And so, as an example of what I mean by that, I was talking last week around biodiversity and the earth system and the ecosystems. And if we looked at the natural systems in the UK, the temperate forests and the open glades that we have when systems are left alone, then what we notice is that there's huge interactions between the different parts of that system, in particular the different levels of the understory. So you've got the trees, and then you've got the shrubs, and you've got the herbs. And below ground, you've got all the different types of mites and nematodes and protozoans and earthworms and all the rest. And they keep the soil healthy and alive. And that soil then nourishes the plants that grow in it, and they are healthier. And likewise, the birds and the other insects act as natural pest control as well. And so that's the way that the world works in nature, the ecosystems around us. And so if we try and mimic that in our agricultural practices, and this is a technique known as layering in a forest garden and a system where you have different levels of shrubs, trees and herbs that are all supplying food, then they're actually far, far more productive per unit area than growing in these large monocultural crops where you have to spray them with different fertilizers and pesticides in order to get them all to grow without having pest outbreaks, because it's all the same thing growing for miles and miles around. And that's what, increasingly report after report from groups like the UN is saying. We need to transition our agriculture from this monoculture, agro-business kind of model to smaller agro-ecological based farming. And so this is just an example of some of the reports that have come out recently. And Olivier de Schutter, who was the former UN Special Rapporteur on the right to food, says that many of the problems in food systems are linked specifically to the uniformity at the heart of the industrial agriculture and its reliance on chemical fertilizers and pesticides. It is not a lack of evidence holding back the agroecological alternative, it is the mismatch between its huge potential to improve outcomes across food systems and its much smaller potential to generate profits for agribusiness firms. So because they're more labour intensive to work, and because they're not using all these pesticides and herbicides, which a lot of agribusiness companies make their money from, they're not advocated for, they're not pushed, and that's why we're not seeing that transition, according to them. So just to give you an example of the potential for this approach to make the changes that we need to see, I've got this short video.
Over millennia, the cradle of Chinese civilization was fundamentally ecologically destroyed, impoverishing the land and the people. In 1995, the Chinese government, with World Bank support, decided to rehabilitate the degraded lands of the Lus Plateau in northwest China. By aligning science, capital investment, policy, and the people's participation to work together with nature instead of against it, within a decade, a large measure of ecological function was returned to 35,000 square kilometers. China's experience on the Lus Plateau is helping to show that it's possible to rehabilitate large-scale damaged ecosystems.
So I guess the key message that I've been trying to drive home throughout this talk is we need to address the systems that are causing the problems that we're seeing. So whether or not that's our energy systems, our financial systems, our food, transport systems, that's what has to change in terms of how they're organized, how they're planned, how they're financed. And so we're asking for systems change, not climate change, okay? So I think there is viable alternatives out there. There are solutions, and they're solutions that will actually benefit our lives. They would make them better. But we have to do this as if our lives depended on it, because we are running out of time, and these transformations have to happen now. It'll be your life's work to see this going on around you. I mean, I don't know which one of these particular systems you'll be most interested in working to find solutions towards, but they are there, and you have to go out and fight for them. So I can say that we can change. There are things we can do. But then the question is, will we change? And that's what I'm going to try and address in the next lecture next week. So thank you all. I appreciate I went over time a little bit. So thanks for bearing with me, and I'll take any questions that you have.